In 1943, the sky over Europe was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard. American heavy bombers flew in tight formations thousands of feet above occupied territory, their silver wings flashing in the sun. From a distance, they looked invincible, floating fortresses moving in disciplined symmetry. But once they crossed the German frontier, the illusion vanished. The air itself seemed to turn hostile. The backbone of the American daylight bombing campaign was the B-17 Flying Fortress. Built with multiple machine gun positions and armored plating, it was designed to defend itself. Military planners believed that tight formations of these bombers could create overlapping fields of fire so intense that no enemy fighter could break through. In theory, the bombers were supposed to protect one another. Reality proved far different. By early 1943, American crews were flying deep into Nazi-controlled Europe without reliable long-range fighter escort. Once they passed beyond the reach of Allied fighters, they were alone. Waiting for them were experienced German pilots flying fast, heavily armed interceptors like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190. The German strategy was precise and ruthless. Fighters would climb above the bomber formations, then dive at high speed, firing cannon shells into engines and cockpits before pulling away. A single 20mm shell could tear through aluminum skin, ignite fuel tanks, or kill a gunner instantly. Sometimes the attacks came head-on, the most dangerous angle of all. The closing speed between bomber and fighter could exceed 600 miles per hour. Gunners had only seconds to react. Inside the bombers, most of the crew were barely out of high school. Tail gunners, waist gunners, ball turret gunners, teenagers operating heavy machine guns at 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. Frostbite was common. Oxygen masks sometimes froze. Hydraulic systems failed. And always there was the fear. Official doctrine instructed bomber gunners to hold their fire until enemy fighters were within 600 yards. The reasoning seemed sound. Ammunition was limited, accuracy improved at closer range. Fire discipline was critical. Gunners were trained not to panic, not to waste rounds, not to shoot too early. But combat rarely followed doctrine. German pilots quickly learned the American playbook. They knew roughly when the bombers would open fire. They understood the effective range of the .50 caliber machine guns. Many attacks were calculated to exploit that narrow window, approaching just outside effective range, stabilizing their aim, then firing devastating bursts before slipping away. The results were catastrophic. In some missions, entire bomber groups were shredded. Aircraft spiraled downward, trailing smoke and flame. Others simply exploded mid-air. Survivors described the sky filled with parachutes, and sometimes parachutes that never opened. During the summer and fall of 1943, casualty rates soared to levels that threatened the entire strategic bombing campaign. One of the most infamous examples came during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions. Waves of bombers were intercepted relentlessly. Losses were so severe that some historians later described the period as unsustainable. Crews began calculating their odds of survival not in years, but in missions. A standard combat tour required 25 missions. For many, that number felt unreachable. The psychological pressure was immense. Every engine vibration felt like damage. Every distant speck in the sky could mean death. Gunners stared through their sights for hours, scanning the horizon, hands numb from cold, knowing that if they hesitated for even a moment, their aircraft might not make it home. And yet, something else was happening inside those bombers. Crew members were observing, adapting, learning. They began to notice patterns in German attacks, the angles, the distances, the hesitation before a dive.
Some gunners whispered that waiting until 600 yards felt wrong. By the time fighters reached that range, they were already firing. The bombers were reacting, not deterring. The official manuals had been written in classrooms and test ranges, but over Germany, theory met reality. The daylight bombing campaign was built on a belief that massed defensive firepower could compensate for the lack of escort fighters, but the enemy was not static. German pilots were veterans of years of combat. They studied bomber formations the way predators study herds. They probed for weakness, isolated aircraft, damaged stragglers, gaps in defensive coverage. When a bomber fell out of formation, it was almost certainly doomed. Still, the missions continued. Factories, rail yards, aircraft plants, these were the targets. American leadership believed that crippling Germany's industrial capacity would shorten the war. So day after day, the bombers launched. Crews climbed aboard knowing the statistics. They checked their weapons. They reviewed procedures. They tried not to think about the burning aircraft they had seen on previous runs. Above 20,000 feet, the world was quiet and beautiful. White clouds stretched endlessly below. Sunlight reflected off polished aluminum. For brief moments, it felt peaceful. Then the contrails appeared. Thin white lines arcing toward the formation. German fighters climbing to intercept. Intercoms crackled to life. Bandits, 3 o'clock high. Turrets began to rotate. Gunners leaned into their sights. Somewhere in the formation, a young man tightened his grip and waited for the enemy to close to 600 yards, just as he had been taught. In those seconds, doctrine and survival stood in direct conflict. The crisis of 1943 was not only about machines or tactics, it was about time, about the fraction of a second between spotting an attacker and pulling the trigger. It was about whether the rule book matched reality, and it was about the growing realization among bomber crews that something had to change, because if it didn't, the skies over Europe would continue to burn.
Before he ever saw combat, before he ever touched the twin 50-caliber machine guns of a bomber turret, Michael Eruth was just a restless teenager from Springfield, Massachusetts. He wasn't a prodigy. He wasn't a decorated cadet from a military academy. In fact, he never finished high school. Like many young men of his generation, the war interrupted whatever plans he might have had. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed distant headlines into personal obligation. Service wasn't just patriotic, it felt inevitable. Springfield was a factory town, shaped by industry and discipline. It was also home to the historic Springfield Armory, a place where American weapons had been manufactured for generations. Growing up around that legacy, Eruth understood machinery. He understood tools. He understood precision. What he didn't yet understand was aerial warfare. When he enlisted in the U.S. Air Forces, he did not become a pilot. Pilot training slots were limited and competitive. Instead, he was assigned to aerial gunnery school, a role just as deadly, but far less celebrated. Gunnery training was rigorous and unforgiving. Recruits learned to track moving targets while standing in vibrating mock turrets. They fired at clay targets launched into the air, simulating attacking fighters. Instructors drilled discipline into them: short bursts, conserve ammunition, never panic. And above all, remember the doctrine: open fire at 600 yards. The number was repeated so often it became instinct. 600 yards, not 500, not 800, 600. The reasoning made sense in controlled conditions. The .50 caliber machine gun had effective range, but accuracy dropped with distance. Waiting until 600 yards ensured tighter shot patterns and better kill probability. Ammunition inside a bomber was finite. Every round mattered. But training grounds in Texas and Nevada were not the same as the skies over Germany. After graduation, Eruth was assigned to a heavy bomber crew flying the B-17 Flying Fortress.
The aircraft lived up to its name in appearance: thick fuselage, multiple gun positions, bristling with defensive firepower. Yet inside, it felt cramped and fragile. Aluminum skin separated the crew from open sky. There was no armor against fear. As one of the gunners, Airruth's job was simple in theory: defend the aircraft from enemy fighters. In reality, it meant long hours scanning empty horizons, knowing that at any second that emptiness could erupt into violence. His first missions were not legendary, they were terrifying. Crossing into enemy territory, the formation would tighten. Engines droned steadily. Oxygen masks hissed. Crew members spoke little. Each man retreated into his own thoughts. Airruth watched the sky through his sight, searching for the smallest flicker of movement. Then he saw them for the first time, dark specks forming in the distance, German interceptors climbing fast. The attacking fighters were often Messerschmitt Bf 109s or Focke-Wulf FW 190s, sleek and aggressive compared to the lumbering bombers. They didn't drift toward the formation, they struck it. The first time cannon shells ripped past his aircraft, Airruth felt the bomber shudder. Metal rang like a struck bell. Someone shouted over the intercom. Another gun position opened fire too early, tracer rounds arcing harmlessly into empty sky. 600 yards. He waited. The fighter grew larger in his sight, closer, closer. At 600 yards, he squeezed the trigger. The guns bucked violently. Tracer rounds streaked outward, but so did the German fire. Shells tore into a neighboring bomber. Smoke poured from an engine. Within seconds, that aircraft slipped out of formation. It never came back. After the mission, crews counted the empty spaces in the barracks. They counted the names that would not answer roll call. Official briefings analyzed formation spacing, escort timing, and weather conditions, but among the enlisted men, different conversations unfolded. That fighter was firing before we even started. They line up just outside range. We're always reacting. Airruth listened more than he spoke. He replayed each engagement in his mind: the distance, the angle, the timing. Something about the 600-yard rule bothered him. It assumed that the gunner's role was purely defensive, that you waited until the enemy committed fully to the attack. But what if waiting was the problem? On later missions, he paid closer attention to the behavior of German pilots. He noticed hesitation when tracers appeared earlier than expected. He noticed slight deviations in their attack runs when defensive fire began sooner. The official doctrine emphasized precision, but perhaps disruption was just as important. At altitude, time compresses. A fighter diving at high speed covers hundreds of yards in seconds. Waiting until 600 yards meant allowing the attacker to stabilize his aim. It meant giving him confidence. Airruth began to ask himself a simple question: what if you made him uncomfortable sooner? He did not announce his doubts to officers. He did not challenge instructors. He simply observed, calculated, considered. On one mission, when fighters formed in the distance, he tracked them carefully through his sight. They were still far, farther than 600 yards. According to the manual, it was too soon. But he could see their line of approach. He could see the intent. His finger rested on the trigger. Inside that vibrating aluminum shell at 25,000 feet, a young gunner from Springfield began to rethink the rulebook, not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. He wasn't trying to become a hero, he was trying to survive, and more than that, he was trying to make sure the men beside him survived too. The transformation did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It grew slowly, mission by mission, shaped by loss and observation. While generals debated strategy on maps, enlisted gunners like Airruth faced the enemy at eye level. By mid-1943, he had reached a quiet conclusion. Doctrine written on paper could not always keep pace with combat reality. And if the rules were costing lives, then perhaps the rules needed to change. He would soon put that belief to the test, high above Europe, where hesitation lasted only seconds, and innovation could mean the difference between another empty bunk or another crew making it home.
By mid-1943, the skies over Europe had become a laboratory of survival. Inside his turret aboard the B-17 Flying Fortress, Michael Aruth had stopped thinking like a student of doctrine. He was thinking like a man who intended to live. The rule was clear: open fire at 600 yards. But combat was teaching a different lesson. German fighter pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190 were not reckless, they were calculating. They approached just outside the bomber's effective range, stabilized their aim, and then committed to high-speed attack runs. By the time American gunners opened fire, the enemy was already firing back. That meant the bomber crews were always reacting. Aruth began to notice something subtle but important. German pilots expected silence at long range. They were comfortable outside 600 yards. They used that space to line up precise shots with 20mm cannon and heavy machine guns. The bombers, lumbering and predictable, gave them a stable target. The doctrine assumed accuracy was everything. But what if disruption mattered more? At altitude, distances collapse quickly. A fighter diving at high speed can close 300 yards in the blink of an eye. Waiting for 600 yards gave the attacker time to aim, time to fire, time to escape. Aruth began calculating in his head. The .50 caliber machine gun had a maximum range far beyond 600 yards. True, accuracy diminished with distance, but tracer rounds served another purpose. They were visible, they were psychological. A stream of tracers arcing toward an incoming fighter at 900 yards might not always hit, but it would force the pilot to adjust. And in aerial combat, even a slight adjustment could ruin a firing solution. The first time he tried it, there was no announcement. The formation was deep over enemy territory. Contrails streaked the sky as German fighters climbed into position. Through his sight, Aruth tracked one aircraft beginning its dive. He judged the distance: 800 yards, 850, 900. Too far, according to the manual. He squeezed the trigger. The twin .50 calibers roared to life. The vibration shook his entire body. Tracer rounds streaked forward in bright orange lines, reaching farther than doctrine allowed. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the German fighter wobbled. Not dramatically, just enough. The nose dipped slightly offline. The attack angle shifted. Instead of holding steady for a perfect head-on shot, the pilot began maneuvering earlier than expected. The firing pass was rushed. Cannon shells burst wide of the formation. The fighter broke away sooner than usual. Inside the bomber, no one said anything immediately, but they had seen it. The enemy's approach had been disrupted. On later missions, Aruth refined the technique. He didn't fire wildly. He didn't waste ammunition recklessly. He tracked carefully, leading his target, sending controlled bursts at extended range. The goal was not immediate destruction, it was pressure. German pilots began encountering defensive fire sooner than expected. Instead of calm, measured approaches, they were forced to weave earlier. That weaving reduced their accuracy. It also increased their exposure to crossfire from other bombers in the formation. Because that was the hidden advantage. When one bomber opened fire at 900 yards, nearby aircraft often followed. A web of tracer streams filled the sky earlier in the engagement. What had once been a narrow defensive window expanded outward. Now fighters had to fly through a longer corridor of gunfire. The tactic began spreading informally. Other gunners asked him about timing. Some were skeptical. Ammunition counts mattered. Crew chiefs didn't like unnecessary expenditure, but the results were difficult to ignore. Fewer bombers were taking catastrophic first strikes. Fighters appeared more hesitant. Head-on attacks, once devastatingly precise, became less coordinated. Aruth understood something fundamental. Air combat was as much mental as mechanical.
A confident fighter pilot was deadly. An uncertain one was vulnerable. By engaging earlier, he introduced doubt. There were risks. Firing too soon could reveal a bomber's position. Ammunition belts could run dry at the worst moment. And if officers believed doctrine was being ignored recklessly, there could be consequences. But survival had its own authority. On one intense mission, multiple fighters lined up for sequential attacks. Aruth opened fire at extended range repeatedly, forcing each approaching aircraft to adjust. In one pass, a German fighter attempting to press through the early tracer fire drifted slightly into the overlapping field of another bomber's guns. The result was devastating. The fighter erupted into smoke and flame. That kill was not solely his, but his early fire had shaped the engagement. Gradually, confirmed victories began to accumulate beside his name, not because he was reckless, because he was proactive. He wasn't the only gunner experimenting with timing during 1943. Across the bomber force, crews were adapting in small ways, but Aruth became one of the clearest examples that the 600-yard rule was not sacred. Combat was dynamic. Doctrine had to be flexible. The skies over Europe were evolving. American bomber formations were no longer purely defensive fortresses waiting for the enemy to close in. In pockets of the air war, they were becoming zones of preemptive suppression, pushing their defensive perimeter outward. And German pilots noticed. Intelligence reports later suggested that some Luftwaffe units adjusted their approach patterns when faced with aggressive long-range defensive fire. Attacks became more cautious, some shifted to different angles, others coordinated more carefully before committing. Aruth never described himself as a revolutionary. He saw what he was doing as common sense under fire. If the enemy was comfortable, make him uncomfortable sooner. Each mission reinforced his belief. 900 yards was not just a number, it was a decision to act instead of react, to challenge assumption, to trust observation over instruction. Inside the freezing metal shell of a bomber turret, a teenager without a diploma was quietly reshaping aerial defense, not through rank, not through official approval, but through results. And the most dramatic proof of that gamble was still to come, in a sky filled with fighters, over a German city that would test every lesson he had learned.
July 30th, 1943 began like many other mission days, with tension disguised as routine. Before dawn, ground crews moved quietly around the waiting line of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. Engines were inspected, ammunition belts were loaded, fuel tanks were topped off. The target that morning was Kassel, Germany, a heavily defended industrial center producing military equipment vital to the German war machine. Inside the briefing room, maps were uncovered. Red lines stretched deep into enemy territory. Flak concentrations were circled in black. Intelligence officers warned of heavy fighter opposition. By mid-1943, missions this far into Germany rarely went uncontested. Among the crew members preparing for takeoff was Michael Aruth. By now, he was no longer the uncertain newcomer scanning the sky in disbelief. He was experienced, focused. He had already begun applying his extended-range firing technique in previous missions, and he knew that Kassel would test it under extreme pressure. The bombers lifted off in waves, forming up over the English countryside before turning east toward the continent. As they crossed into occupied Europe, the mood shifted. Oxygen masks were checked. Intercoms crackled with clipped confirmations. Each crew member settled into his station. Hours later, contrails appeared in the distance. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. German fighters were climbing to intercept, among them fast, agile Messerschmitt Bf 109s and heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW 190s. They did not attack all at once. They circled, gathering altitude, waiting for the optimal moment. Then they came. The first wave dove head-on into the formation. The closing speed was terrifying. At over 600 miles per hour combined velocity, seconds determined survival. Inside his turret, Aruth tracked the lead fighter. 900 yards. He opened fire. Twin streams of tracer rounds leapt forward, reaching far beyond the traditional 600-yard threshold. Other gunners, seeing the incoming fighters, followed suit. The sky lit up earlier than the German pilots expected. One fighter pressed through the tracer curtain, cannons flashing. Shells ripped into a bomber 2 positions ahead, sending debris into the air. But the attack line had shifted. The German pilot, forced to maneuver earlier under long-range fire, failed to hold a steady aim. His burst was brief. As he broke away, Aruth adjusted his lead and fired again. This time, his tracers walked directly into the fuselage. Witnesses later reported seeing smoke pour from the fighter's engine before it rolled inverted and fell away. The battle intensified. Wave after wave of interceptors attacked from different angles, high, low, and head-on. Flak bursts from the ground added black clouds of exploding steel to the chaos. Bombers shook violently as near misses rocked their frames. In one pass, a pair of German fighters coordinated a pincer movement approaching from opposite sides. Aruth engaged the nearer aircraft at extended range, forcing it to veer slightly. That slight deviation exposed it to crossfire from another bomber's waist guns. The fighter took hits, trailed smoke, and spiraled downward. Moments later, another interceptor committed to a direct frontal assault. At extreme closing speed, Aruth began firing earlier than anyone else in the formation. The German pilot held his line longer this time, determined to break through. Cannon flashes flickered from the fighter's wings. The distance collapsed. Aruth adjusted his aim upward, anticipating the climb-out. His tracers converged on the cockpit area. The fighter jerked sharply, its nose pitching upward unnaturally before rolling off into a steep dive. It did not recover. Inside the bomber, the intercom was alive with shouted bearings and damage reports. One engine was losing oil pressure. A crew member was wounded in the waist position. Still, the formation held. Over Kassel, anti-aircraft fire intensified. Bomb bay doors opened. The aircraft lurched slightly as bombs released toward the industrial complex below. Smoke from previous raids hung over the city. But the most dangerous phase was not the bombing run, it was the withdrawal. German fighters regrouped for renewed attacks as the bombers turned for home. Ammunition belts were running low. Barrels were hot. Fatigue set in. Another fighter appeared at long range, angling up for a final pass. Aruth engaged at extended distance once more. This time, the enemy pilot attempted to weave through the tracer fire, zigzagging aggressively. The maneuver disrupted his aim and slowed him just enough. Aruth tightened his burst. The fighter erupted in fragments, pieces breaking away against the blue sky. By the time the surviving bombers crossed back toward Allied territory, the cost was visible. Several aircraft were missing, others limped home with damaged engines and wounded crews. But something else was evident, too. The aggressive early fire defense had forced repeated adjustments in German attack patterns. Instead of clean, confident firing runs, many interceptors had been rushed, deflected, or exposed to crossfire. In the debriefing that followed, confirmed victories were tallied. Gun camera footage and witness statements were reviewed. Aruth's name appeared again and again. His total number of confirmed aerial victories climbed, eventually reaching 17, making him the highest-scoring American aerial gunner of the war. Yet those numbers did not fully capture what had happened over Kassel. The battle demonstrated that bomber defense could be proactive, that pushing the engagement envelope outward could reduce the precision of enemy attacks, that a rule written in training manuals was not necessarily the final word in combat. For Aruth, the mission was not about personal glory. It was about the empty bunks he had seen after earlier raids. It was about reducing the odds, even slightly,
that another crew would vanish from formation in smoke and flame. On July 30th, 1943, high above Kassel, innovation met its ultimate test. And it worked.
When the surviving bombers of the Kassel raid finally touched down, there was no dramatic ceremony waiting on the runway. There were no speeches, just exhausted crews climbing down from battered aircraft, boots hitting cold English concrete, faces marked by oil, sweat, and cordite residue. Mechanics immediately surrounded the damaged B-17 Flying Fortress, counting holes in aluminum skin. Medics rushed wounded men away on stretchers. And inside the intelligence hut, something else was happening. After-action reports were being written. Gun camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. Debriefing officers asked precise questions. When did you open fire? At what range? How did the fighter react? By now, Michael Aruth had accumulated 17 confirmed aerial victories, an extraordinary number for a gunner. But the statistic alone was not what caught attention. It was the pattern. He consistently engaged enemy fighters at extended range. Officially, the 600-yard rule still stood. It had not been erased from training manuals overnight. Military institutions do not pivot quickly. Doctrine is written carefully and changed carefully. But war accelerates adaptation. Among bomber crews, word traveled fast. Gunners talked between missions. They shared observations in mess halls and barracks. Many had already begun experimenting with longer engagement distances after witnessing how early tracer fire disrupted German attack runs. What had started as individual initiative was becoming collective behavior. German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 191 were still deadly, but their approach patterns were shifting. Some attacks were less direct. Others began from steeper angles. Coordinated head-on assaults became more cautious in sectors where defensive fire erupted earlier than expected. A subtle psychological shift was taking place in the air war. Instead of feeling hunted, bomber formations began projecting aggression outward. They were still vulnerable, still heavy, still slower than interceptors, but the defensive perimeter had expanded. Military analysts noticed the change in engagement timing. Reports began referencing earlier defensive fire in certain bomber groups. Ammunition expenditure rates were studied. So were survival rates. At the same time, the broader strategic picture was evolving. Long-range escort fighters were gradually entering service, most famously the P-51 Mustang. With drop tanks extending their range, these escorts could accompany bombers deep into Germany. The arrival of such aircraft dramatically altered the balance of power in the skies. But before escorts became consistently available, bomber crews had relied heavily on themselves. The extended range firing approach was not a miracle cure. It did not eliminate losses. It did not make heavy bombers invulnerable. However, it demonstrated something important. Doctrine could evolve from the bottom up. Innovation did not always originate in headquarters. Sometimes it began inside a freezing turret at 25,000 feet. As 1944 approached, American air superiority steadily increased. Escort fighters grew more dominant. German fuel shortages worsened. The Luftwaffe's ability to mount large-scale interceptions declined. For Aruth, combat missions eventually came to an end. The war would move forward without him in the turret. What surprised many people later was not his combat record, it was his silence. After the war, he did not seek fame. He did not pursue publicity tours or write dramatic memoirs. He returned to civilian life with the same quiet practicality he had carried into the sky. For him, the war had been a duty, not a platform. Those who served with him described him as steady rather than flamboyant, analytical rather than reckless. His innovation had never been about bravado. It had been about protecting the crew, about increasing their margin of survival by seconds and yards. Military historians would later examine the evolution of bomber defensive tactics during 1943 and 1944. They would note how engagement ranges adapted under combat pressure.
They would discuss how flexibility in the field shaped long-term air doctrine. But behind those academic analyses was a simple truth. A teenager from Springfield, Massachusetts, a high school dropout, had looked at a rule and asked whether it truly reflected reality. In a war defined by massive industrial output, global strategies, and political decisions, his contribution was measured in something much smaller: distance. 300 extra yards of defensive fire, 900 instead of 600. In that difference lay disrupted attack runs, broken firing solutions, and in some cases, bombers that made it home instead of falling in flames over Europe. The legacy of early fire was not just tactical, it was philosophical. Combat demands adaptation. Rigid thinking can be as dangerous as enemy fire, and sometimes the people closest to the problem see solutions first. By the end of the war, American air power had transformed. Escort fighters roamed deep into enemy airspace. Bomber losses declined compared to the darkest months of 1943. Air superiority paved the way for the Allied advance across Europe. Yet the memory of those brutal, earlier missions remained, the period when bomber crews faced near impossible odds and survival depended on initiative. In the vast machinery of World War II, many names were forgotten. Many acts of quiet innovation went undocumented. But high above Kassel and in countless other engagements, one gunner had proven that sometimes changing the outcome of a battle begins not with a new aircraft or a new weapon, but with the courage to pull the trigger a little sooner.